Today, we're going to be talking about finding the voice of the child who inhabits our memories. And I'm careful to say that we're finding the voice of the child who inhabits our memories as opposed to using the word inner child, because there's a lot of really nuanced and complicated work that is done in a lot of different fields. And I don't want any connotations, which is something separate from those things. So we'll just sort of move forward. And before we begin, I want to acknowledge that I am presenting this from Fayette County, Kentucky. And I'm presenting this on land that belongs to the Shawnee, Osage, Cherokee, Adena, and the Hopewell. And something that can kind of just get us started thinking about story. I was doing research on the Shawnee pretty recently. And when I went to sources by and large written by white folks, I kept seeing the words was and were and lots of past tense to describe the Shawnee and their culture. And when I went to sources written by the Shawnee themselves, I saw lots of is and are and present tense verbs used to describe the Shawnee. And maybe that can help us just start thinking about what story is and how story works and how far-reaching story is. Even a little choice like that has a big effect, right, in the story that we're telling. And we're always telling stories. Before we begin, I want to start with some community agreements. I borrowed these directly from Narrative 4, but they actually work perfect for this workshop. So we'll kind of go over them and then give a thumbs up at the end to make sure that they work for everyone. So the first is be present and be engaged. I think we all already know about how distractions work, so I'm not even going to lecture us on distractions. But I will say, for me, this is about believing that you're worthy of giving yourself time and space, time to think about your own story and time to reflect. Our culture does not necessarily give us permission to just sit and reflect or do something that isn't productive for our society at large. But I would say, one, it is productive for our society at large for you to be reflective of yourself, and to be mindful that you can be a distraction unto yourself. We're going to be respectful. So really that just means make sure that we let other people have space, be mindful of how we're using space if we are sharing with each other. And also make some space for yourself. If you are sharing, believe that you are worthy of sharing and that your story, no matter how insignificant you might feel that it is worthy of being shared. Be trustworthy. So as a general rule, if we are in a space where a story is being shared, and again, you are not required to share anything that you don't want to share today, assume that the story should not leave this space unless the person who has shared it with you has explicitly, without any question, told you that you can take this story elsewhere. Speak from the heart. So that means a lot of different things, but I think it can also here definitely mean just honoring your own boundaries. And if you don't want to tell something, if you feel like you are uncomfortable, then don't feel like you need to. And also trust yourself. We are not necessarily writing poetry today. We're all going to be doing lots of different things, but sometimes we are so busy seeing ourselves from other people's lenses that we don't trust ourselves, and we can't speak from the heart from that example. A good example, Silas House is a Kentucky writer, and he says sometimes his character is barefoot because his character is barefoot, but he's an Appalachian writer writing about Appalachian people, and he's aware of stereotypes. So he refuses to take on the lens of other people looking at him and says, I'm just going to let my characters be who they are. Be open to new stories and new learning. I think in this context, what I love about stories is you can't argue with them. If someone tells me what happened to them, or someone tells me something that happened when they were 5, I can't just say, no, I disagree. A story is a story. I think in this space, it means letting someone else's story be and not trying to diminish the space of that story in any way. Even if maybe the conclusions or content of that story aren't things that you're necessarily comfortable with. And then lastly, be human. I love this one. This is one of the things I love most about storytelling. We're going to get it wrong, period. Something happened right in my past, and now I want to put it on paper. I'm already not telling the truth because it happened and now it's on paper. This paper is not what happened. It's paper and it's words. And those are now being filtered through me, so they're already imperfect. So for me, it's very liberating. The moment I put something down, I know that it's not perfect. It's not a 100% coherent capturing of what happened. So allow other people to be imperfect and allow yourself to be imperfect. Thumbs up, smiley face emoji if you agree. If we have any disagreements, I guess you could go do something really fun. That there's lots of fun things happening, but I'm looking forward to working with everybody today. So our objective is not any form of therapy or anything like that. We're just going to consider the place of memory in the stories that we tell. And those stories can be in lots of different forms. And we're also talking about not just what we tell each other, but what we tell ourselves. So I want you to start with remembering a meal. Any meal that you want. Just take a second and try to remember it. Where were you? Who were you with? When was it? What were you eating, maybe? Now that you have a meal in mind, can you remember a second meal? Just add to that a meal. Is there another meal you can think of? I now have 2 meals in my mind. Can you remember a third meal? So I'm asking you, can you remember 3 meals in your life that you've had? Hopefully that's enough time for us to sort of have in mind 3 meals. We're going to break into groups. And what I want you to do, you'll have one partner, maybe there'll be a group of 2 partners. Take 60 seconds each and just tell that partner about that meal, whatever you want to tell them. No specific requirement other than that. Just tell someone else about the meal that you were. Welcome back. I hope no one was like mid-sentence about the most important part of a meal. No. But I wanted to start with meals for a reason. And that reason has to do with how storytelling works. So storytelling is narrative plus meaning. And when we talk about narrative, we really mean some way of presenting events that has a perspective and that has purpose. And that really matters here because I am 40 years old and we each have about 1,000 meals a year. I've had 40,000 meals in my life. I do not think I could tell you 40,000 stories. I don't know that I could tell you 1,000. I don't know if I could tell you over 100, right? There's a reason that we can't remember every single meal, and that has to do with how meaning works in storytelling. It has to do with what's called narrative theory. Mind you, I am no scientist, but the basic idea behind narrative theory replaces some older forms that we had about how our brains think. The most prevalent form maybe 3 or 4 decades ago was assimilation and accommodation, that basically we're just sort of expanding and separating models of units of things we can understand. But most scientists now believe that we process the world, see the world, and understand the world almost entirely in story form. And when I say story, I mean a narrative with meaning. So there's a reason when you were talking that you were talking about whichever meal you were talking about. Likely it was a meaningful moment for you. That meaning is the thread that sort of helps create who you are. In fact, narrative theory suggests that nearly all of our identity is basically just a big bunch of stories bundled together. Evolution drives those stories. Our biology drives those stories. There's certain stories we crave innately. Our society and culture help create what sort of stories matter to us. And today, what we're going to be talking about is our engagement with the world in the context of all those things. that helps determine what our stories look like. And in a very unscientific, experiential way, I've divided what I call recurring stories into 3 types. And we're going to look at those so that we can specifically know which types we're dealing with when we write. So the first group I call scratching memories. So a scratching memory is something that's vaguely emotional and it's pretty recent. And I call it a scratching memory because it's sort of always itching right there under the surface. Maybe a coworker said something really rude to you, or maybe a coworker flirted with you. Maybe you got flowers. But whatever it is, you haven't really made sense of it, and it just keeps coming back over and over. Often these are the things that come into our brain when we're in meetings or when we're taking a hot shower. Here's an example from my life of a scratching memory. I was doing a book reading in Cincinnati, Ohio, which is a few hours away from where I live. And there were about 15 people in the audience, and one of them looked like my ex-student who would have graduated 10 years ago. She was also the only African-American person in this entire group. So a part of me wanted to say, hey, Haley, thank you for coming all the way here. And a part of me was terrified that if that wasn't Haley, then this would be a major faux pas that might make someone very uncomfortable. And so I didn't know what was the right thing to do. Do I potentially get this wrong, or do I potentially ignore a student? I ended up not acknowledging her, and it was her, right? So this is a scratching memory because it has come back into my mind over and over and over, and I keep thinking, did I do the right thing? These are not figured out yet, and they're on the surface because we haven't yet planted them. We haven't really figured out what that story means. And so we don't know how, in terms of narrative, to attach meaning to it, right? If you're writing, these are great for journals, because if you start to write about one of these scratching memories, you will find yourself writing about 15 different moments from your past, because meaning works through connection. We try to find other narratives onto which to attach things. And that gets me to the second group, which I call branching memories. And again, these are purely made up groups that I've made up. But branching memories are logic-ish. And that means it's a logic that means something to you. So these are events usually further back in your life that you return to over and over again because they explain something. And this is really important. You are going to that story. So for example, maybe you are with a romantic partner and you're trying to figure out why they're acting a certain way that makes you uncomfortable. And then you remember your ex who was manipulative. And you go, that's what you're doing. You're manipulating me. I know this story, right? A branching memory works like that. It's an established story that you can use to understand reality. And again, you are the one that's navigating to it. A simple one for me, my first semester of college, I was giving a presentation in class, and there was another student under his breath, kind of like making fun of everything I said, the sounds of it. And I realized he was making fun of my accent. So here I am giving my first presentation in college, and someone's making fun of how I talk. At the time, it hurt really bad. It doesn't now. But when I find myself in scenarios in which I can't figure out why I feel like I'm not being taken seriously, and I'm thinking about it, I'll go to that memory and go, yes, that's what's happening. It's happening again. So again, these feel figured out. They're often planted. And if you ever wanted to start with one of those and start writing, you would often find that it becomes a great motif moment. You'll probably remember lots of moments that you ultimately ended up attaching to that branching memory. But today, we're not going to necessarily focus on branching or scratching memories. We're going to focus on what I call flooding memories. Flooding memories are beneath the skin. And what I mean by that is you don't necessarily try to find a flooding memory, it finds you. So maybe you find yourself breathing heavily and realize that you are not consciously in the moment that you're in, but you're actually where you were when you were 7 years old. Or maybe you find yourself tense and realize that in your body, you are actually where you were 10 years ago when something bad happened. Maybe you find yourself completely relaxed and you realize that somewhere in your mind, you are actually on your grandmother's couch wrapped in blankets. These are called flooding memories because our body will actually return to them before our conscious does. And I use the term flooding memory, but I want to attribute this. Toni Morrison came up with the idea. And here's why she calls it a flooding memory. She says water has a place where it goes. And humans will take that water and use levees and dikes and all kinds of things to try to move it out of the way. And then we will try to build something there. And when the water returns, we call it a flood, but it's not a flood. It's water remembering where it used to be, and it will return there. And so she says when a writer has a rush of imagination, it often comes from a flood, from us standing right where we used to be without realizing it. And it's starting under our skin. So what we want to do today is what writers do, which is use writing as a tool for processing those flooding memories and accessing those flooding memories. And we want to do that because of some science. And I'm going to keep this science really small. We only have 5 bullets. First, when I talk about you and your personhood, I could not be meaning this in a bigger way. So we've all heard of childhood amnesia, this idea that for most people before you're 3 or 4, you really don't remember anything. And we used to think it's because children's brains weren't developed enough. But most researchers now believe that it's because those children don't have a sense of self yet, and they don't have a well enough developed sense of self to attach memories to. Think back to the meals that you remembered. You remember because they were meaningful, and they were meaningful because they connected to who you are in that circumstance. But if you don't have a sense of self, you can't even form those sorts of memories. Researchers believe that literally your sense of self, which is built from stories, is the anchor that all memories can even be attached to, and all understanding of the entire world. Another thing to remember is that not all memory is conscious, right? So even children who are so young that they might not remember in 10 years a given moment still do remember things. In the West, it was Descartes who sort of introduced this idea of the lute player, who, when playing the lute, doesn't stop and think which note is next, right? They just play. And there's lots of different types of memories, and intercorporeal is the one that we're going to be thinking about today the most, because it's a memory that deals with your body. In fact, scientists can measure your memories and predict what sort of memories you have based upon your body. Some scientists did an experiment where they put virtual reality headsets on people and then just had them experience neutral environments, a park, a school, a classroom, a living room. And they measured their body's response as they were doing this. And even though they were subtle, they were able to predict with astonishing accuracy whether or not that person had experienced something very positive or very negative in those environments, because the body itself remembered. And then the last piece, which is most important for narrative 4, is that if you have increased episodic memory, i.e. if you remember events more thoroughly or more of them, that actually correlates to higher levels of empathy. Because the more that you can remember, the more that you are in touch with who you are and aware of it, and even able to shift it, which means you're able to do that for other people as well. So I want us to take a little 3-minute meditation. And I use the word meditation very lightly. It can mean whatever it means to you. You can turn off your screens if you want, but close your eyes. If you feel more comfortable with your eyes open, that's okay. But take 3 minutes and imagine yourself as a child, any age you want, whatever age comes. Feel inside your body and let whatever memories come. And if you want to make a physical list, just jotting down words you can of what memories are coming, or if you just want to experience it and not write it down at all, you can also do that. But let's take just a few minutes and close our eyes and let some floods happen. Try to bring whatever thoughts you're having to a close. What we're going to do is be put into smaller groups. You can answer any of these that you want or none at all, but just sort of talk about the experience, what was coming back, what did you see, smell, taste, hear, anything unexpected? And what was the body's role in this, if anything at all? And again, share whatever you do want to share or don't want to share. There we go. All right, I hope y'all had fruitful discussions. We did. We also ignored some of the questions that I gave. So I'm sure you did too. I want to briefly talk about why I'm talking about this, and how I kind of got to this process. So in September of 2021, I was named the Teacher of the Year in the state of Kentucky, which was a mind-blowing honor for me because there were 40,000 teachers in the state of Kentucky. And I live in a very conservative town and am clearly fabulously gay. So that actually wasn't always easy. And very quickly, this sort of beautiful moment turned not so beautiful, because some far-right extremists started targeting me, and then targeting my students. Those targets were death threats. Those targets were scary and dangerous things being mailed to our homes. And I wouldn't even get too much into that, other than I became a teacher because school was this wonderful, magical place for me. And I suddenly found myself in a very different scenario in which school was a very dangerous place for me and for my students, my former students who were LGBTQ. And I was writing an email to my superintendent expressing just how angry I was when I felt this overwhelming memory flood back. And it was so overwhelming that I had to stop writing the email and start writing a poem, which is how it sort of surfaced for me. And that poem was a memory of being 5 years old in a McDonald's, wanting the toy for girls, and the worker shaming my mother for it. And that poem was quickly followed by another poem, was quickly followed by another poem, which eventually became an entire book, Gay Poems for Red States. But what was interesting to me is that, unlike usually when I was writing poetry, I sort of went in having some thought about what I wanted to write about, and I would let that guide me. But in this case, I was so emotional that these memories were sort of surfacing, and I would let the memory and the episodes guide sort of what I was writing. And I ended up writing From the Flood. And I just want to share a couple of pieces of advice about this. As I was writing, there was actually only one poem I didn't write that I wanted to write, one flood that I couldn't articulate. And the poet laureate of the United States, Ada Limon, happened to come to our town, our very small town. And I asked her, what do you do when there's a memory that you want to write and you can't? And this was her advice, that she said memories are in the body. She led with this. And so she said, sometimes the memory is too big for the body. So pick something else in the room and write about it, and your body will make its way over to that thing. She said, sometimes you can't even write about the room. You might need to write about the town, but your body will make its way there and it will articulate itself. Just a few weeks ago, Nikki Finney came to the University of Kentucky, and a student asked a very similar question to her. And she said this, and she's fantastic. She said, do not write the story or poem that you want to intellectualize. Let your body write it the way it wants to tell. And I love this idea because she's talking about those unspoken things. If we're writing from the body, we're necessarily writing, or we're often writing from unarticulated places. It's in those unarticulated moments that we can find deeper processing, which gives us more control of the narratives that are guiding our lives. So following that advice, I wrote this poem called Requiem for $1 for Christmas Fair. I'm going to share this one as an example of sort of what this can look like. I don't want anyone here to feel like they need to write a poem. You can do whatever you want. I'm just a firm believer in sharing with others if I'm going to ask them to do something. So I'll share, and then we will very quickly go into a space where you all can write, and then we'll just kind of regroup. And this was published by Salvation South. They're fantastic if you want to follow some good writing. Requiem for $1 store Christmas fair. They cut off the lights to the Christmas tree when they cut off the lights to the house. The discouraged winds cried through the December wood, paneled walls of our single-wide trailer, held just back enough by the melted butter morning sunlight for us to open the one gift my mom had scratched out of money meant for flour and eggs. Me and Sissy each opened a plush white polar bear who wore a thick red scarf that felt soft like rabbit ears lying in green spring clover, and if you held real tight to his paw like you were afraid he'd leave, he'd sing Silent Night in twinkling tones. He was alive. At night, I took hold of his offered hand, pressed my face into his soft bare chest, and let his carols bury me below the river of frozen walls, weeping old dirges I was still too little to understand. We moved to my aunt's house when the water was scared stiff and wouldn't leave its pipes. My breathing and my body were both too soft for her husband to share air or blood with. So Mom said, just try not to let him see you. And when we get money, we can go home. I built blood ties, breathed air, kept warm with the kinship of my white polar bear. Our scattered blankets, rising snow, our fire-swept igloo nestled in the tundra of the soft, light space-time that let us in between the box spring and the floor. One night it rained in the winter, and the crying ghosts found us, came flooding down the walls, begging for us to remember how they used to be alive. I closed my eyes. I squeezed his paw and held my breath. Before the bear even got to the part that says all is calm, all is bright, the door cannoned open and the winds of my uncle lashed us across imaginary borders. Bear and boy thud against the bed. I told you not to play that shit at night because I need to sleep and you just live to irk me. He mauled his shirtless path to the front door, lightning raging across itself in the sky, the bear dangling in terror and shock, his last dull notes still spraying out. The screen door screamed open and rain punched the ground even though the ground was already dead. He threw the bear into the thundering darkness of angry rain. The walls were wailing. My drumming breath kept time with them. The world melted back into motion. I crawled alone into our igloo. My mom stood at the event horizon. I spoke first. Do we have money yet? This is a flood that has come back to me many times in my life when I felt totally hopeless or powerless. And in writing it, I was able to take ownership of it and to be more cognitively in contact with it as opposed to just in my body. So what I invite you to do is write about anything you want and remember anything you want. And we're going to take maybe close 7 minutes. Do not feel the need to write a poem. Write whatever you want and let the body lead it. And you can just turn your screen off if you want. Thank you all for sharing. One thing, we'll do one last little sentence. Usually, if we do a story exchange, we give a hope to the person whose story we've just heard, but you just heard your own story. So if you could take 30 seconds, 60 seconds, and write a hope to the you were, who just told you that story. Any hope that you want about what their life becomes, about what they have, what they get, what they experience. Feel free to just write that or think that. Give you a minute to think about your hope. And since those are personal, I want to ask you to share those. But my hope for you is that you give yourself time when you're feeling any kind of emotion to ask yourself, where is my body and where has it been? And what story is it telling? And I just want to thank you all for coming today and sharing with me. It's been a really positive experience for me. And so I thank you for making